Get comfortable. Turn the lamp down low, pull the blanket up under your chin, and let the day loosen its grip on you. Because tonight's story is a quiet one. It ends softer than it begins, and it asks nothing of you but that you rest. It starts with a woman named Amanda, a kettle coming slowly to a boil, and rain against a dark window somewhere in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. It starts on the night she found the messages, and the first thing you should know, the thing that surprised even her, is that she didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't drive to wherever he was and make a scene, and she didn't call his mother or her sister or the woman whose name kept lighting up the screen. She just stood in her own kitchen at a little past 11 at night, in a house that had felt like hers for 8 years, and she watched the steam rise, and she made herself a cup of tea. That was all. That was the whole beginning of it. I want to tell you the rest slowly, the way it actually happened, because the shape of a life doesn't change all at once, no matter what the movies say. It changes the way frost comes to a garden, quietly, overnight, so that you wake up and the world is simply different, and you can't point to the exact moment it turned. So settle in. We have all the time we need. Amanda was 38 that autumn, and she had been married to Grant for 12 years, and with him for 15. If you had asked her, even a week before that night, whether she was happy, she would have paused a beat too long and then said, "Yes, of course." The way you'd answer a question about the weather. She wasn't unhappy. That was the trouble with it, really. She had drifted into a life that was comfortable enough that she'd stopped noticing how small it had gotten. She worked at the branch library on the east side of town, the little brick one with the reading garden out back that nobody weeded but her. She liked the work. She liked the smell of the returns cart in the morning, and the old men who came in to read the newspaper, and the shy kids who slid picture books across the desk without meeting her eyes. It was a steady, gentle way to spend a life, and it paid the kind of salary that didn't make you rich, but didn't leave you frightened. And for a long time, that had felt like enough. Grant was 41, and he sold heating and cooling systems for a regional company, and he was good at it, better than he let on. He had a big, easy laugh and a way of remembering everyone's name, and when Amanda had first met him at a friend's barbecue on a hot July afternoon, she had thought he was the warmest person in the yard. People gravitated to him. She had gravitated to him. It had felt, back then, like standing near a wood stove in January. Here is a thing about warmth, though, that Amanda would spend that whole rainy autumn learning. Warmth that's turned toward everyone isn't the same as warmth that's turned toward you. A wood stove heats the whole room, and you can stand next to it for years and still go to bed cold. When had it started to narrow? That was the question she'd turn over later in the quiet apartment on the nights she couldn't sleep. She couldn't find a single moment because there wasn't one. There was just a long, slow accumulation of small surrenders, each one so reasonable at the time that she'd made it without noticing she was making it at all. She used to sing in a little community choir on Tuesday nights, back before they were married. She'd let it go the year they bought the house, because there was so much to do. And Grant didn't like eating dinner alone, and it seemed selfish somehow to leave him 2 evenings a week. She used to have a whole windowsill of plants, herbs and a lemon tree in a blue pot, and she used to spend Sunday mornings with her hands in soil, and she'd let that go too, a little at a time, until the only green thing left in the house was a plastic fern on top of the refrigerator that nobody had to remember to water. She used to have friends. Not many, but the good, worn-in kind, the ones you don't have to explain yourself to. There was Nora especially, who she'd known since they were both 22 and broke and living on cereal. Nora with her loud laugh and her terrible taste in movies and her way of saying the true thing out loud that everyone else was thinking. Somewhere in the marriage, Amanda had let Nora slide to the edges of her life. Not on purpose. It was just that Grant thought Nora was too much, and it was easier not to have the conversation. And so the coffees got farther apart. And then they were birthday texts. And then they were nothing much at all. None of it had felt like loss at the time. That's the part that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Each small thing she set down for a good reason. For the marriage, for peace, for him. And every one of those reasons was the kind you'd nod along to. It was only when you stood back and looked at the whole windowsill, empty now, that you understood a woman had slowly disappeared from her own life, one Tuesday and one lemon tree at a time. If you want to know how it happens, how a whole self gets quietly mislaid, here is the shape of it in one small memory. Early in the marriage, Amanda had wanted to paint the spare room a warm butter yellow, a color she loved, and she'd bought the sample and brushed a patch on the wall and stood back happy. Grant had wrinkled his nose and said it looked like a nursery, and laughed, not unkindly, and suggested a nice grey instead. And she'd painted it grey. That was all. No fight, no wound. Just one small, daily surrender of a thing she liked for a thing he preferred. Again and again, until the whole house was a color she'd never have chosen, and she'd honestly forgotten she once wanted yellow. You don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself one nice grey wall at a time. Grant didn't do it to her. She would be very clear about that later, on the nights she was being honest. He didn't demand it, most of it. He just had preferences, strong ones, and she had a talent for arranging herself around them, the way water arranges itself around a stone. She'd been raised to be easy to live with. She'd been good at it. She'd been so good at it that by 38, she could hardly remember what she'd have chosen if there'd been no one to please. The cracks, when she looked back for them, had been there for a while. She just hadn't let herself read them as cracks. There was the way he'd started taking his phone into the bathroom with him, and the way it was always face down now on the counter, and the way he'd gotten a passcode he'd never bothered with before. There was the new gym membership and the new cologne, and the sudden interest in what he wore on Thursdays. Thursdays. She'd think about the Thursdays a lot afterward. For most of a year, Thursday had been poker night, a standing thing with the guys from his old job, and she'd been glad of it, honestly. Glad he had his friends. Glad of a quiet evening to herself, even if she mostly spent it folding laundry and half watching something. She'd never once questioned a Thursday. Why would she? Trust, when you've had it a long time, stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the floor you stand on. You don't check the floor. There had been 100 small tells, and she had explained away every single one, because the alternative was to pull a thread she wasn't ready to pull. Human beings are wonderful at not seeing what would cost too much to see. She wasn't stupid. She was just tired and comfortable and afraid in a way she couldn't name yet. And so she'd kept the peace with herself the same way she kept it with him, by looking slightly away. And then came the Tuesday in October, when she stopped looking away. And the strange part, the part she would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward, was that she didn't even mean to. She hadn't gone searching for anything. She'd made no decision to finally know. The knowing simply arrived, uninvited and complete, in the middle of an ordinary rainy evening, the way the biggest things in a life so often do, right when you've stopped bracing for them. It was an ordinary evening. Rain, the good, steady Oregon kind that settles in for the season and becomes a sound you stop hearing. Grant was in the shower. Amanda was at the kitchen counter with a mug of tea going cold at her elbow, and she picked up the tablet, the shared one, the family one, the one they used for recipes and the grocery list and nothing private at all. She was going to look up whether the hardware store was still open. That was the whole intention. She wanted to know about a store. The tablet was signed into his account too. It had been for years. They'd set it up together on some lazy Sunday long ago and never thought about it again. And because they'd never thought about it again, his messages came to it. She had honestly forgotten that they did. And so, when the screen woke up, there was a conversation open, mid-thread, the way you leave a thing open when you set a device down in a hurry, and a name at the top that Amanda didn't know, and beneath the name, words. She didn't go looking. I want you to hear that, because she needed to hear it herself later, on the nights the guilt tried to turn itself around and point at her. She wasn't snooping. The thing surfaced on its own, in her own kitchen, on a device that was as much hers as his, and once it was in front of her, there was no unseeing it. Some doors, once they're open even a crack, you can't get closed again, no matter how much you'd give to go back to the second before. She read enough. She would never be able to say exactly how much, because time did a strange thing in those minutes, folded up and stretched out at the same time. But she read enough to understand that it had been going on for the better part of a year, and that it was serious in the way these things get serious, and that he had written to this woman, more than once, the exact soft words he used to write to Amanda in the early days, when the warmth had still been turned toward her. There was one line she couldn't get out of her head afterward. It wasn't the worst line, not really. It was small. He'd written, "Can't wait for Thursday." 3 words and a Thursday, and the whole architecture of a year came apart in Amanda's chest, quietly, like a building being taken down from the inside, so that it stands one moment and is rubble the next, and never seems to fall. The shower was still running down the hall. She could hear it, and under it his tuneless humming, the same 3 notes he always hummed, a sound she'd stopped noticing a decade ago and now heard with terrible clarity. He was in there, humming. He had no idea that anything in the world had changed, and Amanda stood in the kitchen holding the tablet, and she waited for the scream to come, the crying, the throwing, whatever it is that's supposed to come. She'd have welcomed it, almost. It would have been simpler. But it didn't come. What came instead was the strangest calm she had ever felt, a stillness so complete it frightened her a little. It was the calm of a person who has been holding a heavy thing for a very long time without knowing it, and who has just, all at once, been allowed to set it down. She set the tablet face down on the counter, exactly where his phone always lay. And she filled the kettle, and she turned the burner on, and she stood and watched the blue flame and waited for the water to boil. Why tea? She asked herself that later, and the answer she came to was this: because it was the one thing in that whole spinning moment that she knew how to do. Because her grandmother had made tea in every crisis of her long life, wars and funerals and joys alike, and something in Amanda's hands remembered that. Because you cannot make a decision while you are drowning, but you can fill a kettle. And sometimes filling the kettle is how you find the surface again. The water boiled. She poured it over the bag in the blue mug, the one with the chip on the handle that she'd had since college, and she carried it to the kitchen table and sat down in the dark. And she looked out the window at the rain running down the glass, and the one lit window of the house across the way, blurred and gold. And she began, very slowly and very quietly, to think. She did not think about revenge. This is important, and it's part of why I wanted to tell you this particular story on this particular kind of night. There are stories where the wronged one gets even, where there's a lawyer and a reckoning, and a moment where the guilty party's face goes pale. And those are good stories too, satisfying in their way. But this isn't one of them. Amanda didn't want to burn his life down. She discovered, sitting there in the dark with her tea, that she didn't want anything from him at all anymore. And that, she would come to understand, was the most final thing she could have felt. What she thought about instead was herself. She thought about the choir she used to sing in, and the lemon tree, and the sound of Nora's laugh. She thought about how long it had been since she'd made a single decision that was only hers, and how she couldn't remember the last time she'd sat alone in a quiet room and felt like the room belonged to her. She thought, this is the coldest I've ever been, standing next to the warmest man in the yard. And then she thought a thing so clear and so simple that it was almost peaceful, the way the first true thing after a long confusion is always almost peaceful. She thought, I am done. Not as a threat, not as a wound, just as a fact, the way you'd note that a season had ended. The tea was still too hot to drink. She sat with both hands around the warm mug, and watched the rain. And outside, the sky over the valley was that deep, drowned blue it gets on autumn nights. And inside, a marriage was ending. Gently, without a single raised voice. And the woman it was ending for felt, for the first time in longer than she could name, entirely awake. Grant came out of the bathroom in a cloud of steam and cologne, toweling his hair, and he saw her sitting there in the dark, and he laughed and said, "Why are you sitting in the dark, weirdo?" and reached for the light switch. And Amanda said, "Don't," in a voice so level it stopped his hand in the air. "Leave it off for a minute," she said. "Sit down. I want to talk to you." He sat. Even then, even in that moment, some animal part of him must have felt the ground shift, because the easy laugh faded off his face and something wary came into it. And Amanda looked at him across the dark table, at the man she'd loved and arranged herself around for 15 years, and she felt no rage at all. Only a great and quiet tenderness for the two young people they'd been at that barbecue, and a sorrow for them that was almost bottomless. And under it all, that strange new steadiness, like bedrock she hadn't known was there. "I saw the messages," she said, "on the tablet. I wasn't looking for them, but I saw them, and I read enough. And I want you to know that I'm not going to yell, and I'm not going to cry in front of you, and I'm not going to ask you the questions you're already getting ready to lie about. I just wanted to tell you, so you'd know I know. That's all for tonight." And Grant did what people do. He said, "It's not what it looks like." He said it fast, on reflex, before he could even know what she'd seen, which told her everything. Then he said the other things, the whole tired script, that they'd grown apart, that he'd been unhappy too, that it didn't mean anything, that he'd been about to end it, that she'd been so distant, that a man has needs, that why was she even on his messages? He reached, near the end, for anger, because anger is the last hiding place, and he said, "You went through my phone," like that was the crime in the room. Amanda let him talk. She didn't defend herself, and she didn't attack, and that unnerved him more than any fight could have, because he'd braced for a storm and gotten still water instead. And there's nothing to push against in still water. When he ran down at last, when the excuses had all been spent and the silence came back, she stood up and rinsed her mug in the sink and set it in the rack. And she said, "I'm going to sleep in the guest room tonight. We'll figure out the rest when it's light. Good night, Grant." And she went down the hall, and she closed the door, and she slept, actually slept, deeper than she had in months, while the rain kept on against the window. That was the night she found the messages. Everything after it, the whole long, gentle unwinding of a life and the slow, careful building of a new one, came out of that quiet hour at the kitchen table. And I promise you, before we're done, we'll get to the part a year later, the part I most want you to hear, when the rain comes back around and Amanda is sitting at a different window with a different cup of tea, and she notices something about herself that makes her laugh out loud in the empty room. But that's the end, and we're not there yet. Rest a while. Let's go slowly. Morning came the way it does in October in that part of the world, not so much a sunrise as a gradual, reluctant greying, the dark thinning out into a pale, wet light, with the evergreens dripping and the street shining. Amanda woke in the narrow guest bed and lay still for a moment, waiting for the grief to land on her like a weight. It didn't, quite. What she felt instead was lighter than grief and stranger, the peculiar, clean feeling of a fever finally breaking, when you're weak and wrung out, but the worst has passed and your body is your own again. She made coffee. Grant was already up, sitting at the kitchen table in yesterday's clothes, and she could tell he hadn't slept. And there was a part of her, the old, trained part, that wanted to comfort him, to make it easier, to smooth the moment over the way she'd smoothed over 1,000 moments. She noticed the impulse, and for the first time in a very long time, she let it go by without obeying it. She poured her coffee, and she sat down across from him, and she waited. He'd spent the night rebuilding himself into someone reasonable. She could see that. He wanted to talk about counseling. He wanted to talk about how every marriage hits rough patches, and how people got through worse than this, and how he'd end it with the woman. Today, this morning, it was already over in his mind, and they could work on things. And did she really want to throw away 15 years over a mistake? He was good with words. It was his job to be good with words, to make the expensive thing sound like the sensible thing. And he turned all that skill on her now across the breakfast table. And here is where you'd expect the story to bend one way or the other, toward the fight or toward the forgiveness. It bent toward neither. Amanda listened to all of it, and when he was finished, she was quiet for a while, turning her coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. And then she said something she hadn't planned, something that surprised her as it came out of her mouth, which is how she knew it was true. She said, "Grant, I believe you'd end it, I do." And 6 months ago, or even a month ago, that would have mattered to me more than anything in the world. But something happened last night while you were in the shower. I stopped wanting to be married to you. Not to punish you. It's just gone. Like a light that went off. And I've been sitting here this whole time trying to find the switch, and there isn't one. I'm not angry. I'm not even sad the way I thought I'd be. I'm just done. And I think I've been done for a lot longer than one night. And it took this to let me see it. He didn't have an answer for that. There is no argument against a person who has simply, quietly, stopped wanting the thing you're offering. He'd been ready to fight for the marriage, and you can fight for a marriage against another person, but you can't fight for it against peace. He looked at her like he was seeing a stranger, and in a way he was, because the woman he'd married had been so good at arranging herself around him that he'd never once had to meet the woman underneath, the one who'd been in there all along, keeping the kettle and waiting. They agreed, that grey morning, on the only things they could agree on yet, which were small and practical and merciful. She would move out, not him, because she was the one who wanted a fresh page, and he was the one who wanted to keep the familiar walls. They would be decent to each other. They wouldn't drag the families into it before they had to. They'd talk to lawyers, but calmly, and they wouldn't turn the lawyers into weapons. It's a strange thing to plan the dismantling of your own life over coffee, in even tones, passing the sugar. But there's a kind of grace in it too. The grace of two people who once loved each other choosing, at the end, not to become monsters. And then Amanda got dressed, and she went to work, because it was a Wednesday, and the library opened at 10, and the returns cart wouldn't sort itself. That's the part they never show you, isn't it? That the morning after your marriage ends, the ordinary world simply expects you to show up, and mostly you do, and there's a mercy hidden in that too. She stood at the desk and checked out picture books, and renewed a hold, and helped an old man print his tax forms, and no one who saw her that day would have guessed that anything at all had changed. Inside, everything had. Outside, she scanned barcodes and said, "Have a nice day," and the ordinary rhythm of it held her up like a hand under her back. It was on her lunch break, sitting in her car in the wet parking lot with a sandwich she wasn't eating, that she did the first brave thing. The first thing that was purely and only hers. She took out her phone, and she scrolled a long way down, past a year of birthday texts and nothing much at all, and she called Nora. Nora picked up on the second ring, surprised because they didn't call each other anymore. They hadn't really called in years, and she said, "Hey, stranger, everything okay?" And Amanda opened her mouth to say the polished thing, the everything's fine thing, the reflex that had run her life. And instead, sitting in her car with the rain on the roof, she heard herself say, in a small and steady voice, "No. No, it's not okay. Grant's been seeing someone, and I found out last night, and I'm leaving him. And Nora, I think I've forgotten how to have a life. Can I come see you?" There was a silence on the line, just a beat, and then Nora said the thing that Amanda would remember for the rest of her days. The thing that told her the door she thought she'd let close was standing open after all. had been standing open the whole time. Nora said, softly, "Oh, honey."
"Where are you right now?"
"I'm already getting my keys." And that was the beginning of the coming back. Not a dramatic thing, just an old friend and a set of keys and a voice that didn't hesitate. Sometimes that's all a rescue is. Sometimes the whole turning of a life is one person on the other end of a phone saying, "I'm already getting my keys, tell me where you are." Nora came that evening, and she didn't lecture, and she didn't gloat, and she didn't say a single "I told you so" about Grant, though she'd earned a few of them over the years. She just sat with Amanda on the floor of Nora's cluttered living room with a takeout carton between them, and let Amanda talk and cry a little, finally, safely, and then laugh at something, and then cry again. And near the end of the night, Nora looked at her and said, "You know what the wild thing is? You seem more like yourself right now, wrecked on my floor, than you have in about 10 years. And Amanda knew it was true, and it scared her. And it also felt like the first solid ground under her feet in longer than she could say. She called her mother that weekend too, which was harder, because her mother was 74 and of a generation that had been taught to stay, to make it work, to keep the family whole whatever the private cost. Amanda braced for disappointment, for the gentle pressure to think it over, to consider counseling, to remember for better or worse. Instead, there was a long quiet on the line, and then her mother said, in a voice Amanda had never quite heard from her, "Well, good for you, sweetheart. I stayed. I'm not sorry I did because I got you out of it, but I stayed a lot of years I didn't have to because nobody ever told me I was allowed to want more. You go want more." It undid Amanda a little, that answer, in the best possible way, because she understood that her mother was reaching across 40 years and 2 whole ways of seeing the world to hand her something like permission. There was only one worry her mother couldn't quite let go of, and she said it near the end of the call, softly, the way that generation says the real thing last. "But who's going to take care of you, honey, out there all alone?" And Amanda, surprising herself, answered without a flicker of doubt. "I am, Mum," she said. "That's the whole point. I'm finally going to take care of me." And her mother was quiet a moment, and then she said, "All right." And Amanda could hear that she was smiling. The next weeks were quiet and full at the same time. There was the practical machinery of an ending to attend to, and Amanda attended to it the way she did everything, steadily, without drama. She found a lawyer, a calm, older woman named Ruth, who came recommended, and she went in braced for a fight she'd have to be talked into. Instead, Ruth listened to the whole story and then set down her pen and said, "In Oregon, dear, you don't need a reason. It's a no-fault state. Nobody has to be proven the villain. The court just divides things fairly and lets you both go on with your lives. And there's a waiting period, about 3 months, so there's no rushing it even if you wanted to. My advice? Use the 3 months to figure out what you actually want, not just what you're running from." Amanda liked that. She liked that no one had to be dragged into court and unmasked, that the law of the place she lived simply made room for the plain fact that 2 people no longer wished to be married and did not require either of them to be a monster to make it so. It fit the thing she already felt. She didn't want Grant destroyed. She wanted, God help her, to be free. And it turned out the machinery for that was quiet and orderly and available to anyone patient enough to fill out the forms. She could have gone after him. Ruth, being thorough, made sure she understood that. 12 years of marriage, his good income and her modest one. The affair, if she'd wanted to make noise about it, though in a no-fault state it wouldn't buy her much. The house they'd built equity in together. A more wounded woman, or a more frightened one, might have tried to take him for everything, might have used the year of Thursdays like a knife. Amanda thought about it, honestly, for about an afternoon. And then she found she didn't have the appetite for it. And more than that, she understood that trying to bleed him would tie her to him, would keep the wound open, would make him the center of her story for years to come. and she didn't want him at the center of her story anymore. She wanted the center back for herself. So she asked only for what was fair, her half of what they'd built, enough to stand up on and start over, and not $1 more that she'd have to fight for. Ruth, who had seen every kind of divorce in 30 years of practice, looked at her with something like respect and said, "You'd be surprised how rare that is, and how well it tends to turn out. The ones who try to win usually lose something they can't name. You're doing the smart thing and the kind thing at once. That's a good way to leave a marriage. It's a good way to leave most things. The hardest part, and the part I want to sit with for a moment, because I think some of you listening tonight already know exactly what I mean, wasn't the lawyer or the logistics, or even the telling of the families. The hardest part was the small, private grief for the life she'd thought she was living. Because you don't just lose a husband when a marriage ends this way. You lose the past, too, a little. Every good memory gets a question mark laid over it. Was that Christmas real, when he'd already met her? Was that trip, that anniversary, that ordinary happy Tuesday? She'd lie awake and feel the whole 15 years shift and blur, and it was a specific and lonely kind of mourning, grieving not just what you had, but whether you ever really had it. Nora helped with that, in her blunt, loving way. She said, "Look, you can't let him steal the good parts too. That's giving him way too much. The choir was real, your lemon tree was real. The person you were in all those years, she was real, even if he wasn't always. Keep her. Leave him." And Amanda held on to that like a railing on a dark stair, because it was true, and because she needed it to be true. The woman she'd been all those years, the one who kept the kettle and weeded the reading garden and loved people generously, that woman was real and worth keeping. It was only the marriage that had gone hollow. She didn't have to throw herself out with it. And so, through that grey, patient Oregon autumn, while the 3-month clock the state required ticked slowly along, Amanda began, very quietly, to do the bravest and least dramatic thing a person can do. She began to imagine a life that was only hers, and then, one small choice at a time, to build it. It started, as these things do, with a place to live. She needed somewhere to go, and on a rainy Saturday in November, with Nora along for courage, she went to look at a little apartment above a coffee roaster on the good old brick street downtown, and she climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, and a woman with a ring of keys opened a door, and Amanda stepped into the rest of her life without yet knowing that was what she was doing. The apartment was small, that was the first thing. After 8 years in a 4-bedroom split level, it was almost comically small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen you could touch both walls of, a living room that would hold a couch and a chair, and not much else. But it had a thing that stopped Amanda in the doorway with her breath caught, and it was the reason she'd said yes before she'd finished walking through it. And it was this. It had a window, a big one, on the west wall of the living room, tall and old-fashioned, the kind they don't build anymore, and it faced out over the rooftops toward the hills. And even on that dishwater November afternoon, the light came through it, soft and generous, and filled the whole small room with a pale gold that seemed to come from nowhere. Amanda stood in that light, in that empty little room that smelled of fresh paint and faintly of roasting coffee from downstairs. And she felt something she had genuinely not expected to feel for a long time, if ever again. She felt hope. Not a big, dramatic surge of it. Just a small, warm, private flicker, like the pilot light in an old stove, the kind that's easy to overlook but that keeps everything else ready to catch. "This is a bright little place," Nora said quietly behind her, and Amanda said, Yes, it is. I'll take it." And the woman with the keys smiled and said the rent was $950 a month, and Amanda, who had spent 15 years arranging her life around what someone else could afford and preferred, thought, "I can do that. That's mine to decide. I can do that all by myself." She signed the lease that afternoon at a wobbly table in the roaster downstairs, over a cup of coffee she paid for herself, and the woman handed her a single small key on a plain ring. And Amanda held it in her palm and looked at it. This little brass key, the smallest key she had ever owned, worn smooth by other hands over the years, and she understood that it was the first door in a very long time that would open onto a space that was only, entirely, unarguably hers. She closed her hand around it. Outside, the rain came down soft and steady on the old brick street, and somewhere a life she'd almost forgotten how to want was quietly waiting for her to move in. The move itself happened on a cold, clear Sunday 2 weeks later, and it was, of all the days in that long autumn, the one Amanda would remember most fondly, which surprised her, because on paper it should have been the saddest. Nora came, and Nora's younger brother came with his pickup truck, and the three of them loaded a whole marriage into the bed of it in a couple of unhurried hours. And the strange thing, the thing Amanda kept turning over, was how little of that marriage she actually wanted to take. She took her books, boxes and boxes of them, because a librarian's books are her bones. She took her grandmother's good dishes and the blue chipped mug and the kettle. She took her clothes and her chair, the soft green one by the window that Grant had always thought was ugly. She took the few small things that were truly hers, a jewelry box, some photographs with the questionable years quietly left out of the pile, a tin of her mother's handwritten recipe cards, a ceramic bird her father had given her when she was 9. And she took the plastic fern off the refrigerator, not because she wanted it, but because she suddenly, fiercely wanted a real one. And the fake one felt like a promise to herself that she'd fix that soon. Everything else she left. The big television, the good leather couch they'd saved for, the dining set, the guest room furniture, the wall of framed photographs, the accumulated weight of a decade of buying things together. Grant, hovering and useless and clearly wretched, kept trying to give her more. "Take the couch," he said. "Take the good television. I don't care about it. Take whatever you want." And there was a part of Amanda that understood he wasn't being generous so much as trying to pay down a debt he couldn't put a number to, trying to buy back a little of himself with a sectional sofa. She said gently, "No, Grant, I don't want the couch. I want a fresh start, and fresh starts are light. You keep the heavy things." It was, in its own quiet way, the closest thing to a reckoning that ever passed between them. And it wasn't a reckoning at all. It was just a woman declining to be weighed down, choosing a nearly empty pickup truck over a house full of proof, and it left him standing in the driveway with nothing to argue against, exactly as her stillness had that first night. You cannot win an argument with a person who has stopped wanting to win. There's a strange power in it, the only kind Amanda ever wanted, which was the power to simply walk away whole. They carried it all up the narrow stairs to the second floor, and by the middle of the afternoon, Nora and her brother had gone, waved off with pizza money and fierce hugs, and Amanda was alone in the small, bright apartment for the first time, standing among a modest scatter of boxes in the pale gold light of that big west window. And this, if you're still with me, is the middle of the story, the hinge of it, the moment everything had been moving toward and everything would move away from. So let me slow down here and let the evening come, because what happened that first night is the whole heart of it. It got dark early, the way it does in November, and the rain came back at dusk, soft against the big window, and Amanda didn't unpack. She meant to. She'd planned a productive, distracting evening of putting a life in order. Instead, she found the box with the kettle in it, and she found the blue mug, and she filled the kettle at her own kitchen sink and set it on her own stove, and stood in the small, warm kitchen, listening to it tick and murmur its way toward a boil, exactly as she had on the night that started all of this. And it struck her, standing there, that she had come full circle in only a handful of weeks, from one kettle to another, and that everything and nothing had changed. She made her tea. She carried it into the empty living room, and there was nowhere to sit but the green chair, So she pulled the green chair over to the big west window, and she sat down in it with the mug warm between her hands. And she looked out at the rain and the rooftops and the few blurred lights coming on across the darkening town. And she waited, the way she'd waited that first night, for the grief to come, for the loneliness of the empty room to land on her, for the fear. It didn't come. What came instead, rising up, slow and certain from somewhere deep, was the strangest and most unfamiliar feeling, and it took her a long moment to even name it because it had been so long. It was contentment. Plain, quiet contentment. The feeling of being exactly where you are and not wishing to be anywhere else. She was 38 years old, newly alone, sitting in a nearly empty apartment on a rainy night with a chipped mug and no plan, and she was, against all sense, at peace. The room was small, the rain was gentle, the tea was good, and every single thing in that little space, the chair, the kettle, the quiet, the decision, the life, was hers. She started, very softly, to hum. She didn't notice she was doing it at first. It was an old tune, one from the Tuesday choir, something she hadn't sung in a dozen years and would have sworn she'd forgotten. And it just rose up out of her there in the dark by the window, quiet and a little rusty and entirely her own. And she thought of Grant humming his 3 tuneless notes in the shower on the night the world changed. A man perfectly at ease in a life built on a lie. And she thought of herself now, humming a real song in an empty room she'd chosen. And she understood that she had traded a large, comfortable falseness for a small, honest truth, and that she would make that trade again 1,000 times. That was the first night. I told you it ends softer than it begins. It was somewhere in the small hours, warm in the green chair with the rain going and the tea long gone cold, that Amanda first heard the sound that would change the texture of her days, though she didn't know it yet. A small, plaintive, insistent sound, right outside the window, almost lost under the rain. She sat still and listened. It came again. It was, unmistakably, a cat. She got up and went to the window, and down on the fire escape landing, hunched against the wet in the spill of light from her window, was a grey cat. Thin, soaked through, one ear notched from some old fight, watching her with the wary, yellow eyes of an animal that has learned not to count on anyone. It didn't run when she appeared. It just looked at her and gave that small, cracked cry again. And Amanda, who had not been allowed a pet in 15 years because Grant said they were dirty and tied you down, stood at her own window in her own apartment and thought, well, look at us. 2 strays out of the rain. She didn't fling the window open and scoop it up, because she knew enough about frightened things by then to know that isn't how it works. She opened the window a crack, and she went and found a can of tuna in a box she hadn't unpacked, and she set a little of it on a saucer on the landing, and then she backed away and sat down in her chair and left the cat to make its own choice in its own time. That was important to her, without her quite being able to say why, that the cat should choose. She was done that autumn with anything that had to be forced. The cat ate. It didn't come in, not that night. It ate and it vanished back into the dark. And Amanda went to bed on a mattress on the floor of her new bedroom and slept the deep, clean sleep she'd been sleeping since the night of the kettle. But in the morning, the saucer was licked, shining, and the grey cat was sitting on the landing in the thin, wet dawn, waiting, with the patient look of an animal that has decided to give a place one more chance. And so it went, a saucer at a time, a day at a time, the cat coming a little closer, trusting a little more, until one truly cold night about 2 weeks on, Amanda opened the window and the grey cat looked at her for a long, considering moment, and then simply walked in over the sill like it had always meant to, and curled up in the green chair and went to sleep, and stayed. She named him Milo. He was, the vet told her when she finally took him in, an older gentleman of a cat, probably 6 or 7, no chip, no owner anyone could find, a survivor of some hard streets who had decided, in his own unhurried time, that Amanda's small, bright apartment was where he would like to spend the rest of his life. And Amanda, filling out the forms at the vet's desk, paying for it out of her own account with no one to ask and no one to answer to, felt a fierce and ridiculous love for this notch-eared grey creature who had shown up in the rain the same season she did and chosen her and stayed. Home, she was learning, is not where you're kept. Home is where you're chosen and where you get to choose back. I want to pause here, just for a moment, because I know some of you listen to these on the hard nights, the ones where the house is too quiet, or the bed is too big, or the phone doesn't ring the way it used to. If that's you tonight, I'm glad you're here. Stay as long as you like. You don't have to be awake for the end. But I'll tell you where we're going, so you can rest easy. We're going toward the part a year on, when the rain comes back around, and I promise it's gentle, and I promise she's all right. Let yourself drift if you need to. The story will keep. Winter came on, the long, grey, wet valley winter, and it turned out to be exactly the right weather for the slow work Amanda was doing, which was the work of learning to keep her own company. It's a real skill, and nobody teaches it to you. And a lot of people go their whole lives without ever learning it, mistaking the fear of being alone for a reason to stay somewhere they shouldn't. Amanda learned it that winter, one quiet evening at a time. She learned that an empty evening isn't the same as a lonely one. She learned to cook small, good meals for one and eat them slowly. She learned the particular pleasure of a Saturday that belongs to no one's plans but yours. I don't want to tell you it was all quiet contentment, because it wasn't, and you'd know I was lying, and this is a night for true things. There was a bad stretch in December, around the holidays, when the loneliness she'd been out running finally caught up with her all at once. It came on a dark, wet evening when the whole town seemed lit up and paired off, and she was alone with a cat and a lemon tree, and some song came on that had been theirs once, years ago, and it knocked the wind clean out of her. She sat down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cupboards and cried the way she hadn't let herself cry the whole time, big and ugly and years deep. She let it come. That was the difference, she'd realize later. She didn't call Grant, and she didn't decide she'd made a terrible mistake, and she didn't try to make it stop. She just let the grief have its hour on the kitchen floor, because she'd earned the grief. It was honest. A real marriage had really ended, and that deserved to be wept for. And after a while, the crying wore itself out the way weather does, and Milo came and stepped into her lap and put his notched face up against her wet chin and purred, and she laughed a little through the last of it. She got up off the floor and washed her face and put the kettle on. In the morning, the sadness had thinned back out to something she could carry. The waves got farther apart after that, the way they always do if you let them come instead of fighting them. But she never forgot that December floor, because it taught her she could survive her own worst night alone and get up and make the tea. And once you know that about yourself, you are free in a way that nothing can ever quite take back. Somewhere in those short, dark months, she did a thing that sounds like nothing and felt like climbing a mountain. She took herself out to dinner, alone, on purpose, to a real restaurant, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And she sat at a table for one, with a book and a glass of wine, and ordered exactly what she pleased. And nobody sighed, and nobody checked the price, and nobody was bored and wanting to leave. For years, she'd have found the very idea unbearably sad, a woman eating by herself. That night she found it was one of the most peaceful hours she had ever spent. And she understood at last the whole difference between being alone and being lonely, which turns out to be only this. Loneliness is missing someone. And what she felt at that small table, warm and unhurried and entirely her own good company, was the clean opposite of missing anyone at all. She filled the windowsill. That was one of the first real joys, and it happened by degrees. A pot of basil from the grocery store, then rosemary, Then a little jade plant Nora brought over as a housewarming thing. Then, on a grey January afternoon that she'd remember, a small lemon tree in a blue ceramic pot, bought with her own money from a nursery on the edge of town, set right in the middle of the big west window where the best of the light fell. It was the same kind of tree she'd let go of years ago without a fight. Buying it back felt like reaching across time and taking the hand of the woman she'd been. By spring, the whole sill was green and crowded and alive, and Milo liked to sit among the pots in the sun, and the small room smelled of soil and herbs and, always, faintly, of coffee from downstairs. She painted the bedroom yellow too, that first winter. A warm butter yellow, the exact color she'd wanted a decade before and been gently laughed out of. And she did it herself, over one long Saturday with the windows cracked and the radio on, and Milo watching the whole operation with deep suspicion from the doorway. When it was done, she stood in the middle of the small, glowing room with paint in her hair, and she laughed out loud, because it was such a little thing, and it felt like such an enormous one. It was only a color. It was entirely her color. She slept in that yellow room every night after, and woke in it happy, and she never once missed the tasteful grey she'd lived inside for all those careful years. And she reached back out into the world, carefully, the way the cat had reached back out to her. She had coffee with Nora every week now, real coffee, real talk. The friendship not just revived, but somehow deeper than before, tempered by the years apart into something that would clearly last the rest of their lives. Through Nora, she met other people and found, to her surprise, that she was good company, that she had opinions and a dry, quiet humor that had been folded away so long she'd forgotten she owned it. She wasn't the wife arranged around a husband anymore. She was just Amanda. And it turned out Amanda was someone people liked to be around. Even the library felt different, though nothing there had changed but her. She'd stand at the desk in the morning light and check out the same picture books to the same shy kids. And she found she had more to give them now, more patience, a real smile instead of the polished one she used to keep at the ready. There was one boy, 7 or so, who never spoke and always chose books about the ocean. And one grey Tuesday, he slid a book across the desk and whispered, "Do you like whales?" And Amanda said she did, very much. And it was the first thing he had ever said to her in a whole year of Tuesdays. She thought about that small opening the entire way home. She knew exactly what it cost a quiet creature to reach a hand out from behind the glass. She'd been doing it herself, all season long, one saucer of tuna and one phone call and one yellow wall at a time. In late February, on a whim that felt enormous at the time, she signed up for a plot at the community garden down by the river, a patchwork of little fenced squares where the town's apartment dwellers and the plant-hungry and the lonely and the green-thumbed all came to put their hands in the dirt. Her plot was a muddy, neglected rectangle when she got it, and she spent a whole raw Saturday just clearing it, pulling old, dead vines and turning the cold soil. And she came home filthy and soaked and aching, and happier than she'd been in years. There is something in the turning of soil that turns something over in a person too. She couldn't have explained it. She only knew she craved it. It was at the garden that she met Dot. Dot had the plot next to hers, and Dot was somewhere north of 70, a small, fierce woman in a man's rain jacket and rubber boots, with a voice like a rusty gate and 40 years of dirt under her nails. And she took one look at Amanda's hopeful, clueless first attempts at a spring planting and said, flatly, "You're going to drown those peas, honey. They don't like wet feet any more than you do." And that was the beginning of a friendship that Amanda would come to treasure more than she'd have believed possible from such an unpromising opening line. Dot was not a warm woman, not on the surface, and that was exactly why Amanda trusted her. She didn't fuss, she didn't pry. She just showed up in the next plot over 3 or 4 mornings a week and taught, by doing, everything she knew, which was a great deal, about peas and beans and the right way to stake a tomato and how to read the sky over the valley and when the last frost was really past, no matter what the calendar claimed. And slowly, over a season of shared silences and past tools and the occasional dry, devastating remark, Dot became something Amanda hadn't known she needed, which was a friend from a whole different chapter of life. Someone who'd buried a husband and outlived most of her friends and still got up every morning to tend a patch of earth, and who was, under all that gruffness, deeply and quietly content. Amanda looked at Dot sometimes and thought, that's a person who long ago chose her own life. I'd like to be like that at 70. The divorce finalized in the spring, quietly, the way everything about it had been quiet. The 3 months the state asked for came and went, the papers were signed, and one ordinary Tuesday, Amanda's lawyer Ruth called to say it was done. She was legally free, and did she want to come by and pick up her copy? And Amanda thanked her and hung up, and sat for a moment at her own kitchen table in the light of her own window, with Milo winding around her ankles, and waited to feel something momentous. She didn't, particularly. It had been over for months in every way that counted. The paper just made official a thing her own heart had settled in a single hour at a kitchen table one rainy October night. She and Grant had stayed decent to the end, which she was glad of, because there were no children to bind them and no reason to poison what little was left. He'd tried, a few times over the winter, to reopen the door. A text here and there, thinking about you, or the house is so quiet, or once, late on a Friday night that she could guess the shape of, I made a huge mistake, and I know it. And Amanda had felt, reading them, not the flare of vindication she might once have wanted, and not the pull of the old habit either, but a kind of distant, roomy kindness, the way you might feel toward a stranger's sadness glimpsed through a train window. She always answered, because she wasn't cruel. She just answered from very far away. I hope you're doing okay, Grant, she wrote him once, and meant it. But I'm not coming back, and it's not because I'm punishing you. It's because I finally have my own life and I like it, and I'm not willing to trade it back. Take care of yourself. And she'd set the phone down and gone back to her lemon tree. And that had been, more or less, the last real conversation of a 15-year love. 2 lines of plain kindness at a window full of plants. And there was a rightness to that ending that no screaming match could ever have given her. She heard, eventually, through the small-town grapevine that runs under every place like that, how it had gone for him. The woman from the messages, the Thursday woman, had not lasted long once she was no longer a secret, once she was just a regular thing in the daylight instead of a thrill in the dark. That's how those often go, Dot observed when Amanda mentioned it, leaning on her hoe. A thing built in the shadows can't usually take the sun. And so by early summer, Grant was alone in the big split level with the good leather couch and the wall where the photographs used to hang. A warm man in a cold house, and Amanda, hearing it, felt no triumph at all, only a passing sorrow, quickly gone, and then the pull of her own bright afternoon calling her back. Because that was the thing she noticed, as the spring turned to summer and her plot at the river began, improbably, to produce actual food, actual peas and lettuces, and the first hard green tomatoes. She noticed that she thought about Grant less and less. Not because she was forcing him out, just because there was so much else now, so much life crowding warmly into the space where the marriage had been. There were seedlings to water, and books to read, and dinners at Nora's, and mornings with Dot, and a grey cat who slept on her chest and purred like a distant motor. Her days had filled themselves, quietly, the way the windowsill had filled with green, until one day she looked around and there simply wasn't room anymore for the old grief. It hadn't been evicted. It had just been gently, thoroughly outgrown. There was one evening in high summer that she'd hold on to, a small, perfect, ordinary evening that came to stand in her memory for the whole of that first year.
She'd come home from the garden with a basket of things she'd grown, and she'd made herself a simple supper of it, and she'd carried her plate and a glass of wine to the green chair by the west window, and the long gold light of a valley evening in July had come pouring in the way it had that very first day. Milo was asleep in a warm coil on the sill among the herbs. Somewhere below, the roaster was closing up, and the smell of coffee drifted up through the open window along with the sounds of the town settling into its evening. And Amanda sat there and ate the food she'd grown with her own hands in a home she'd made with her own hands, and she was so quietly, completely happy that it brought sudden tears to her eyes, and she laughed at herself for it, alone in the golden room. And Milo opened one eye and closed it again. She went back to the choir too that fall. This is a small thing, but I want to give it to you, because it closes a circle that opened way back at the start. She saw a flyer at the library, the same community choir she'd sung with in her 20s, still going, still meeting on Tuesday nights, still short on altos. And she stood at the desk holding the flyer and felt the old familiar reflex rise up. The one that said, "Oh, but Tuesday nights, but dinner, but someone might not like it." And then she remembered that there was no one now whose dinner she had to be home for, no one to please but herself. And that the whole point of everything she'd built that year was that Tuesday nights were hers to spend however she chose. So she went. And she stood in a church basement among 24 strangers and a few half-remembered faces, and opened her mouth and sang. And the sound that came out was rusty and imperfect and utterly, gloriously hers. And she went home that night and hummed all the way up the narrow stairs. And so we come, at last, to the part I promised you, the part I most wanted you to hear, the part that comes a full year on. It was October again. The rains have come back to the valley, soft and steady and settling in for the season. The same rain that had been falling on the night everything changed. And Amanda was sitting in the green chair by the big west window, in the small, bright apartment that was wholly and only hers, with a fresh cup of tea in the blue, chipped mug going warm in her hands, and Milo a heavy grey comfort in her lap, and the lemon tree grown tall and glossy beside her, and the rain running down the dark glass exactly as it had a year before. And she realized, sitting there, that a strange thing had happened to her over the year, so gradually she'd never marked the day of it. She had stopped being angry. Not decided to stop, not worked at forgiveness, not any of the effortful things the world tells you you're supposed to do. She had simply, somewhere along the way, gotten so busy living that she'd forgotten to keep the anger going, and it had quietly starved and died and blown away like the dead vines she'd cleared from her plot in February. She would notice, now and then, that a whole week had gone by in which she hadn't thought of Grant even once, and she'd almost feel she ought to, the way you feel you ought to remember an old obligation, and then she'd laugh, because there was nothing to remember and nowhere to be but here. That's what she found at her window, a year on. She kept forgetting to be angry. She was too busy being free. And if you had asked her, that second rainy October, whether she was happy, she would not have paused a beat too long the way she once had. She would have looked around the small gold room, at the plants and the cat and the rain and the good, honest quiet of a life she had chosen and built and could lose to no one. And she would have said yes, simply, the way you say a thing that is plainly and wholly true. Here is what became of the rest of them, the way these stories like to close. Grant sold the big house eventually, the one that had gotten too quiet, and moved to a smaller place across town. And the last Amanda heard, he was doing all right. Warmer, perhaps, for having learned the cost of things, though that was no longer any of her business, and she wished him no ill. Nora is still her closest friend, and always will be, and they are the kind of old women, someday, who will sit on a porch and finish each other's sentences. Dot taught her everything about that garden, and then, 2 summers later, passed away peacefully in her sleep, in the middle of the growing season, and Amanda tends both plots now, hers and Dot's, and grows Dot's tomatoes every year, and talks to her a little while she does it. And Milo, the grey cat who chose her out of the rain, sleeps in the green chair every night of his long, contented retirement, and asks for nothing but tuna and the warm spot in the sun, and gives back more than he knows. And Amanda keeps the kettle. That's the image I want to leave you with, as the lamp burns low and the night settles all the way down. A woman at a window on a rainy autumn night, a cup of tea in a chipped blue mug, a cat in her lap, and green things growing all around her, humming an old song to herself in a room that is entirely, unarguably, her own. She didn't scream on the night that everything changed. She didn't burn anything down or take anything for herself, but her own two hands and her own quiet dignity. She just filled the kettle and waited for the water to boil, and chose, gently and without fireworks, to save her own life. And it worked. That's the whole story. Sometimes the bravest thing a person ever does makes no noise at all. So if you're still with me, drifting now at the edge of sleep, let this be the thought you carry down with you: that it is never too late to choose yourself, and that choosing yourself doesn't have to mean a war, that sometimes it is only a quiet decision made at a kitchen table in the dark, and a kettle, and the patience to let a new life grow the way a garden grows, one season at a time. You are allowed to want a life that is your own. You always were. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me. If this story kept you gentle company tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd give it a like so more people who need a soft place to land can find their way here. And if you'd like more stories like this one, follow along, because there's always another waiting for the next quiet night. And before you drift all the way off, tell me one thing in the comments when you wake, whenever that is. Was Amanda right to walk away so quietly, without ever making him answer for it? Or would you have needed more of a reckoning to let it go? There's no wrong answer, only your own true one. And I'm always curious what state you're all listening from and how old you are, so leave that too, if you like, so we can see this little late-night company we keep. For now, though, there's nothing left to do but rest. The kettle's off, the rain's still falling. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one.